Okay, I believe our recording has started, and I'd like to welcome everybody to our second discussion event of the spring 2026 semester, which is Policy Potpourri, a virtual panel discussion on domestic issues that's being hosted by the Department of History and Political Science and the School of Arts and Letters here at MGA. Also co-sponsored by the MGA Political Science Student Organization, as well as the Alpha Mu Zeta chapter of Pi Sigma Alpha, the National Honorary Society for Political Science. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind everybody that the speakers' views are their own and do not necessarily represent those of Middle Georgia State University, its organizational units, Pi Sigma Alpha, the George C. Marshall Center for European Studies, even though Dr. Matchrock is not here, so we don't have to worry about that part, or any other organizations that we may be affiliated with. Um, so first, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. And I apologize, I meant to have that in alphabetical order and did not. I will introduce them in alphabetical order, and that is first start with Dr. Grace Adams Square, who's an assistant professor of political science, who's been here at Middle Georgia State since 2011, and has a doctorate in education in educational policy from Drexel University. Also, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Hall, Associate Professor of Political Science, who has been here at Middle Georgia State since 2015. He has a doctorate in Public Policy Administration from Auburn University, and I will be serving as your moderator for the next hour and a half or so. I'm Dr. Christopher Lawrence. I'm a professor of political science and have been here since 2012, and my PhD in political science is from the University of Mississippi. So, for those of you that have not joined us before, just a couple of ground rules and informational items. We will get started with a few topics that the panelists and I discussed earlier, but we're also more than happy to have your questions as well. And so we will accept those via the chat window. So feel free to ask those questions at any time. We may not necessarily get to them immediately, but I do encourage you to write any questions or any follow-ups you might have in the chat, and we'll try to get to those as we can. Just a couple ground rules on that. First, while you're welcome to ask multiple questions, we will prioritize letting everybody have a chance to ask questions. So if you have lots of questions, please go one at a time and give other participants the opportunity to ask questions as well. Also, please be courteous and civil to each other in the chat window today. Just bear in mind those obligations as members of the Middle Georgia State University community. So some of the topics we may discuss include the ongoing conflict with Iran, which has escalated in a couple of weeks quite a bit since we had our first discussion. And so I did decide to include that foreign policy issue, even though this was intended to be mostly a domestic policy discussion. But I felt that given the current events, it would be kind of the elephant in the room if we didn't talk about it a little bit. There is a couple of situations going on with the Department of Homeland Security at the moment with a partial government shutdown, as well as the replacement of the leadership of that department. And also, President Trump is pushing for a new law called the SAVE Act, and we'll discuss that, what the implications of that law might be. And last but not least, we will also be discussing some Supreme Court cases that are being considered by the justices this year. And we will talk about those. So, without further ado, I will drop my presentation here and start with our questions. So question number one. Nearly 2 weeks ago, on February 28th, Israel and the United States launched a war against Iran, including both air and naval strikes. What is the purpose of this war? How long is it likely to continue? And is some sort of ground invasion a likely prospect? And I'll let Dr. Adams Square lead off.
Thank you, Chris. And I was really glad for this question. It's a good question. As you stated, that the conflict began on February 28th, which was a weekend. And when we returned to school the following week, many of my students were not familiar with what had transpired. So this became a good teachable moment A good talking point to discuss the role of the president, the relation to Congress, and the War Powers Resolution Act. The purpose of the war has been cyclical, like a moving target, and has changed over time. The conflict is being called Operation Epic Furry. And I'm using the word conflict because Congress has not publicly declared war according to the Constitution. President Trump has said the objective of this operation was deplete and destroy the Iranian Navy, yet the operation appears less as an isolated military escalation, but a broader strategic transition. And then one of the things that he had mentioned is that he had been involved with prior negotiations, which led to Iran being unresponsive. And so he also described Iran as the greatest state sponsor of terror, that they were a threat that needed to be eliminated, not just in terms of their nuclear ambitions, but its ballistic missiles, its funding of terrorism, and the oppression and slaughter of its own people. But I wanted to understand what were some of these prior negotiations that were going on that brought them to this conclusion. And it's not finite, what I have, but just from what I was researching to find out the prior negotiations, they were looking in terms of these negotiations were talking about mineral partnerships, expansion, increasing the Gulf India economic negotiations, advance that, major subsea cable investments linking North America with South Asia and Middle Eastern data hubs. And the goal was to move it from planning stages into deployment. And these networks are designed to underpin artificial intelligence deployment, cloud computing markets, and next generation digital trade across rapidly growing economies. And the thought was that Iran was going to be a disruptor to all of this strategic competition going on, and they were going to make their plans that they were making more Iran being a disruptor. And so, from this perspective, the strikes addressed not only immediate security concerns, but the perceived concept of long term risk that continued instability surrounding Iran, and that Iran could undermine these economic architectures that the US was using as their central strategy. And then the other thing that I wanted to look at was try to develop a timeline, because you mentioned starting the 28th. The president came on to speak on Monday, March 9th. And one of the things that I noticed when we first started this conflict, the word war was being used. But when President Trump spoke on March 9th, he used the word excursion. And he said that it was going to be a short term excursion. And then Secretary of War Pete Hegseth spoke the next day. And one of the things that he was saying was that uh, on March 10th, that Iran is standing alone in this, and that the United States was basically being ruthless and using precision. So you also asked, how long is it likely to continue? Initially, we heard 8 weeks. I also heard possibly 6 months. But when the president spoke this week, I heard the word soon. I also heard the Secretary of State say, our timeline is our own choosing. And then I also heard from his department the statement that we will not relent until the enemy is totally, uh, decisively defeated. And then the last part of your question, in some sort of ground invasion, a likely prospect, President Trump and Secretary of War Hegseth have stated that there aren't going to be any ground troops, but then they left the possibility open that it may be U.S. ground troops. And one of the things that we know is that Israel has demonstrated it has some ground troops there. And then just one final thing before I turn it over to John, I didn't mean to monopolize the whole thing here. There was this discussion that Israel had contacted President Trump, basically giving him the statistics and parameters of where the Ayatollah was. And then this led to this excursion. President Trump has also said that Iran was ready to attack Israel and that they were trying to help Israel before Iran attacked. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Dr. Adams Square. That's a fantastic summary. Not much that I could add. What I would look at in terms of what are the goals of this war? And again, when using the term war, when using the word conflict, they're relatively interchangeable. As all of our students know, we've only had 5 declared wars in the history of this country. So it is a relative area of semantics until you get into the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which the Democrats have brought up and failed to have that passed. Which kind of reins in the power of the president to wage war. There are a couple of things, just to add on to what Dr. Adams Gray Square has already mentioned, in terms of goals. One is regime change. Now, that's something that we have to take a second to look at because regime change is a very important goal of a war. First and foremost, we technically have removed the old regime in that we killed the Ayatollah Khamenei and many of his leadership personnel. Many of the mullahs have been killed by precision strikes from the Israelis and the United States in the very early days of the war. But we have functionally replaced the Ayatollah Khamenei with his son, the Ayatollah Khamenei, who is a much younger, much, I would argue, angrier version of the Ayatollah because we have, along with the Israelis, killed most of his family. So we've replaced the Ayatollah with a younger Ayatollah who might be even more angry at the United States. The other key element to regime change is that it is predicated on the assumption of boots on the ground. There have been no examples in history of sheer air power leading to a pure regime change. There was a little bit of an anomaly in the mid 90s in the Baltics, in the Balkans with the Clinton administration. But if you're going to regime change, you're talking boots on the ground. And if you're talking boots on the ground in Iran, you are not talking about a couple of 100,000. You're talking about a million and a half troops. Iran is 3 times the size of Iraq. We don't have 1.5 million combat troops. So that's a very confusing area of the Trump administration. When you talk about regime change, that almost insinuates an extraordinary large number of combat troops on the ground, which we do not have. President Trump and the Trump administration, they've had some inconsistencies here in that, like Dr. Adams Gray Square already mentioned, they've mentioned that we're not going to have boots on the ground, but we are possibly going to have boots on the ground. We don't know. I believe it's the 82nd Airborne Division has canceled a training project that they had in the works that could insinuate that the 82nd is possibly getting ready to go to Iran. And absolutely no disrespect to the 82nd Airborne, the 82nd Airborne is not enough to regime change Iran. Regime change is a very big issue, and it requires an enormous amount of infrastructure and troops on the ground. The Trump administration is also, as has been mentioned, wanting to end the nuclear arms capability of the Iranians, which itself brings up some questions because the precision strikes last year by the Israelis and the Americans, we claimed that we did, in fact, cripple the Iranian nuclear infrastructure that we are now claiming needs to be crippled again, which we are doing by attacking sites at Fordo and a couple of other areas that have deep, deep bunkers that are hard to get at. The Trump administration also wanted the Iranians to end their ballistic missile program, which the Iranians said outright, no, we will not do that. That was a deal breaker. They said absolutely not. And they do have an arsenal of ballistic missiles that they are using right now to attack U.S. forces in the area and U.S. allies, the Gulf states. They've even gone so far as to attack Cyprus and Turkey expanding this war into a much larger, possible larger affair. So they also have said that the Trump administration has said that we want to end the Iranian support for their proxy terror groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah in Gaza and in Lebanon, what's left of them. Also ending their support for the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and the Iranians said absolutely not. We will not do that. So there are a number of different objectives for the Trump administration. Some of them have been relatively contradictory. So in terms of what are we there for, I would have to answer with, I'm not sure, because what are we there for leads us to the most important question, and that is, when will we leave? When can we declare victory? And again, we just don't necessarily know. If it's regime change, we're there for a decade. We will initiate a draft. I mean, I don't mean this to be in any way hyperbolic or to be concerning, but if we are seriously considering a regime change, that will require troops on the ground. That President Trump has said that he must personally approve of the leadership of Iran. I don't know if I have to explain how peculiar that is to anyone listening. Any leader telling any country that they have to personally approve of their leader, that's kind of it's kind of a deal breaker in and of itself. So what are our goals? Ending Iranian nuclear capability, ending the Iranian missile defense system, ending the Iranian support for terror groups in the area, and regime change. All four of those have been mentioned, and all four of those represent very different strategic aims of the Trump administration. When this war will end, we have no idea. What we do know is that, and this is no disrespect whatsoever to the lives that are being lost, to the brave men and women of the U.S. military, to civilians who are casualties of this war, but there is an economic component here that is potentially one of the most dangerous macroeconomic realities that we have seen in quite some time. The Strait of Hormuz has been closed. The Strait of Hormuz has about 20% of all the world's oil, about 25% of natural gas. If the Strait of Hormuz were to stay closed for a matter of weeks, that could be economically devastating. If it were to stay closed for a matter of months, that is literally unimaginable. That is the epicenter of a possible global economic recession that would make 2008 look potentially tame. And I don't mean any disrespect to the economic recession of 2008 when I say that. Much of Asia requires oil from the Strait of Hormuz, and they are not getting it. Nation states like Japan bring in about 75% of their oil from the Strait of Hormuz. They cannot survive for more than 3 or 4 to 6 months, depending on the sources. Taiwan receives the majority of its natural gas from the Strait of Hormuz, and they produce about 90% of all microprocessors. There are so many things that we make out of oil that will also be impacted. So global markets are definitely looking at the Strait of Hormuz. That's really one of the areas of this war that is of the utmost concern. So if I were to predict when this war will end, I think there's a possibility that the Trump administration will recognize that this might be spinning out of control, that the economic devastation that could be coming might be overwhelmingly dangerous for Republicans in the November midterm elections. And there's the possibility that President Trump will simply declare victory and move on. That is something that President Trump has shown in the past to do. So that might be, in my opinion, the most likely way for this war to end quickly. And that, again, would be President Trump simply declaring victory and moving on with his agenda. If not that, this war could rage on for months and months on end. So I'm personally hoping for the Trump administration to simply recognize that this has become politically unfeasible, that it is getting a little bit out of hand, and to simply declare victory, move on to the next item. That's a theory. But I would put money on that theory. I do believe that's how this will end.
Thank you, Dr. Adam Square and Dr. Hall. Yeah, I think the only thing I would probably add to that is that there are a couple things, right? The first thing is, I think, Dr. Hall kind of alluded to this at the end of his answer. The choice to end this war is not necessarily ours alone, right? Iran may still decide that they want to continue to retaliate or bomb or attack other countries, and so Just if when, I'm not sure that they would necessarily stop that activity if we stopped. And then, of course, there's also the role of Israel, right? Israel may decide that they have different strategic goals than the Trump administration, and they may decide that they need to continue the war even if Trump and our administration does not want to. And kind of related to that, right? The Israelis sort of have this metaphor of mowing the grass, right? The idea is that you kind of roll in every once in a while and kind of decapitate parts of the regime, the nuclear program, maybe some other programs, and that sort of thing. Is that something that the Israelis and that, for that matter, the United States want to continue with, right? Is there sort of an idea that we want to make this the line in the sand, the war that settles this, or do we want to just sort of kick the can down the road, right? I think that there's pressure in both directions, right? Where as you both noted, right, the economic pressure is certainly on declare victory and go home, contingent on the Iranians going with that. But at the same time, you know, that doesn't guarantee that it doesn't flare up again before the midterms or, that sort of thing. And, um, you know, at the end of the day, I'm not sure that certainly the Israeli demands, and it sounds like the Trump's demands can be satisfied short of regime change. Now, I guess there's the third mechanism that we haven't really talked about in terms of could there be internal regime change, that sort of thing. I think that would be hard in the absence of some external actors helping with that. Would that require necessarily millions of American troops on the ground, or I don't know if there was an internal movement that was supported by special forces and that sort of thing. Maybe that could be successful, but it doesn't seem like the regime itself is collapsing at this point. It doesn't seem, at the same time, it doesn't seem like that they're really effectively running the country either. So it seems like that things have kind of gotten very decentralized. We haven't seen any hide or hair of the alleged new supreme leader in public yet. It's all Memorex at this point. So, there's speculation that he is, dead or, incapacitated or not in great health, and was probably there, given that his wife was apparently there. When the senior Ayatollah was attacked. So, um, lots of questions to be asked. Probably not anything we're going to be able to answer today. But yeah, there is that fundamental tension, that everybody's kind of alluded to between, Trump's sort of instinct of declare victory and go home versus the reality of I'm not sure declare victory and go home is a strategy that either the Israelis or the Iranians are really going to be happy with at this point. And so, what does it take to convince both of them to put to end the war? Because it's not just the U.S. at this point, and it's also the Arab neighbors of Iran as well, right? Now that they're getting bombed and things like that, maybe they don't want to tolerate Iran in the neighborhood or this regime in the neighborhood, and so it's become a very multifaceted thing very quickly, and it's kind of spiraled out of the control of just the U.S. or just Israel or, for that matter, just Iran. So I think it's time to kind of shift gears. And by the way, if you do have questions, please do post those in the chat. Do have some observations posted in the chat, but I don't know if there are really questions, so you can review those if you like. But I think we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. And that is, there has been an ongoing government shutdown, partial government shutdown for the last several weeks. Well, how is that different from a regular government shutdown? What is a partial government shutdown? And what are the ongoing effects on the functioning of the national government and its employees? I know that it's particularly affected, rather, parts of the Department of Homeland Security. And I, again, will let Dr. Adam Square lead off with that.
Thank you, John. Chris, I'm sorry.
Okay.
For those who may be on here as students, we need to make you aware that there are 15 departments that make up the president's cabinet. The secretary of the department is nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So the federal government that is currently partially shut down is the Department of Homeland Security, which came into existence after 9/11. And there's 22 agencies that currently make up the Department of Homeland Security. Thus, a partial shutdown means that only a portion of the government is shut down. So not all 15 departments and their agencies, but just a portion. And so as it's relating to this question, our focus and attention then is on the Department of Homeland Security and not even all of their 22 agencies. So only a percentage of those agencies are really affected by the shutdown, which is TSA, FEMA, Coast Guard, and Secret Service. And TSA are the individuals that you see when you go to the airport who pat you down and give you clearance so that you can board a plane. I want to say, in terms of myself, I've been involved with these shutdowns as a person going through the airports, both in the full shutdown and just recently in this partial shutdown. So as a eyewitness going through the airport, the message that you get being live in the airport is different than what you get on the news, because the news is basically articulating that it's, really a massive inconvenience to the traveler, that there are long lines, and that's not really the case. I've went through both times, very smooth. I watched the Atlanta news the other day, and they basically were saying that your wait time was only about 30 minutes. So I just wanted to say a lot of times situations are exasperated or exaggerated when you're listening to certain broadcasts, and it's not really as so. The other part of that question in terms of, I think we answered it in terms of what is a partial government shutdown. In terms of what is its ongoing effects, I think at this point in time that even though the TSA individuals are not being paid at this time, internally, they are providing support system for TSA employees. So they have a shuttle service that they're supplying. They're helping in terms of daycare. And so they are really trying to make a smooth operation and transition during this partial shutdown. However, there is this one caveat that if you are a TSA employee and you call off during the shutdown, when it does come time for you to get your payment, you will be impacted by that. So that's about it as it relates to that particular question.
Thank you, Grace. Again, not much to add to that. You really did a great job thoroughly summarizing the issue there. I would point out one thing, and mainly because we are literally just covering this in my in our 1101 class. One might wonder, how does this even happen? How is it possible that Democrats, with a minority in the House and a minority in the Senate and no control over the White House, obviously, how can they pull this off? And this brings us to everyone's favorite Senate rule, and that is, of course, the filibuster. The Democrats, this is a perfect example of what we talked about literally today in class, and that is a filibuster. They've been able to block the Republicans' funding for the Department of Homeland Security. One other element of this that is of interest, and that is, how long could this last? What is it that's being demanded? Why the Department of Homeland Security? Why not the Department of Transportation? Why not the Department of Defense? And it has a lot to do with the fact that the Department of Homeland Security, since its inception, has had some political elements to it. And in this case in particular, if anyone's familiar with the news over the last year and with the deployment of ICE in Minnesota in particular, there were some overwhelmingly questionable tactics being used. 2 U.S. citizens who were killed in the streets, and all of this is on video. Everyone has probably seen the highly disturbing footage. That's one of the demands of the Democrats. The Democrats are wanting reform of ICE. They're wanting and demanding reform of this executive branch agency based on the overwhelming violence that they're seeing. We've also seen a massive influx of new personnel into ICE. The Trump administration has pushed aggressively for more and more ICE agents, and there have been significant questions regarding the training program and questions as to whether or not these new ICE members are thoroughly vetted and thoroughly trained. When you see the 2 U.S. citizens who were killed in the streets, it's impossible to walk away from that image not wondering, how did that happen when if you have thorough and effective training programs for ICE. Again, I'm not taking away from the many personnel in ICE who work who enforce the laws put forth by Congress, but that was controversial, and it still is. The Democrats are demanding reform of ICE. They want to remove some of the new ICE tactics, and I'm sure we've seen masks on police officers or on ICE agents. When we think of executive branch police agents, whether it be at the state, local, or federal level, masks on police agents is absolutely unacceptable historically in this country. The reason for the masks, the Trump administration has said there's the danger of being doxxed, of having ICE agents exposed on the internet and people going after their families. But then there's also that element of, you are the police, in this case, the executive branch agency, ICE. You don't get to hide your face. The Democratic Party does not want masks. They want identification. They want accountability. They want, again, like I said, they want reform in ICE. And that's really one of the major elements here. And unfortunately, it is affecting many other elements of DHS. An interesting thing here is that so many members of the Department of Homeland Security are considered what the federal government calls essential workers. Yeah. And when you are an essential worker, you don't get furloughed. There are many people in many different departments throughout the history of our republic when we've gone through full government shutdowns. The longest government shutdown we ever had was just this last November. That simply get furloughed. They're told, don't show up to work. You're not getting paid. You can come back to work when Congress has a budget, or at least a continuing resolution to temporarily fund. But if you're an essential agent, you get the opportunity to come to work without pay. And as a result, that does lead, as we see with the TSA, to many people who are getting sick. And it's understandable that if you're not getting paid week after week after week, you might call in sick as well. So the overall question of when will this end is a great question that I do not have an answer for. And both sides seem to be at a crossroads where there is very little progress being made. So as disturbing as this partial government shutdown is now, particularly as it relates to the Department of Homeland Security, there is a very good opportunity for this to last weeks and weeks into the future. There's a great chance that it ends tomorrow. But this is one that's somewhat open-ended, and I really don't have any opinions on when this is going to end. If I was in Las Vegas and I had to place a bet on when this ends, I would not place a bet. This could get, as Dr. Adam Square pointed out, there are elements of this that might seem a little bit more terrifying depending on the airport that you're going to. Over the next few weeks, as this continues to progress, this could get a lot worse. But these essential workers are still, again, required to show up. So if the Democrats and Republicans can come together and agree on either a temporary funding, continuing resolution, or actual reform that the Democrats are demanding, that is going to be the best opportunity for this to end. And we all hope it does, especially anyone going anywhere for spring break.
Thank you all. Yeah, so we have a follow-up question from the chat, which is, I don't know if any of us know the answer to this. Is the pay affected as if it was a normal call-out, or is it affected more during the partial shutdown? I assume that would mean in terms of, like, do they get their back pay and that sort of thing if they do call out sick, or I guess a personal day, or whatever. I'm not sure what TSA employees are even entitled to in terms of benefits.
That's a great question. From what I understand, those essential employees are required to show up to work. And if, as Dr. Adam Square pointed out, if they are found to be in violation of that or staying out because of that pay, there can be repercussions. But from what I understand, they are expected to come to work without pay. And at the end, when the budget, when the funding is appropriated, they will get all of that money in back pay. In terms of how they handle people who call in sick, I'm not entirely sure. That's a great question.
I guess that would be a suggestion for further research for everybody. I can only speak anecdotally. I flew last week out of Atlanta. I have pre-checks, so the line was not terribly long. I don't know what the regular line times were that day. And I flew back out of a very small airport where TSA was, not that busy. I can't really speak beyond that anecdote, but I would imagine it's probably pretty uneven across the country. It just depends a lot on local workforce and that sort of thing, and maybe how they're scheduling things. I don't know, but as these things go on, they tend to get worse in terms of sick outs, and they're gonna at some point they're going to lose employees, right? Because people are going to say that after a month of not getting a paycheck, they're just going to decide, okay, I'm going to go and work at Denny's or whatever, and it's going to be hard to replace anybody when it's like, okay, well, you might get paid in September. So I mean, there probably will be some attrition in employees over time if this continues to go on. I think they just missed the first paycheck or are just about to miss the first paycheck. So I know it was sometime in the first couple weeks of March where it was expected they were going to lose the first week paycheck. So that I think that's where you'll probably see the impacts, and also kind of leading into our next question, perhaps the pressure on Congress to do something about it. And related to that, we have another DHS kind of related question, which is about the head of the Department of Homeland Security. Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, was recently reassigned to other responsibilities, and President Trump is planning to replace her with a senator from Oklahoma, Markwayne Mullin. Why does it appear that he removed her from that position, and what, if any, impact is this decision going to have on both the ongoing immigration crackdown, and I guess also perhaps the prospects of settling the partial government shutdown? And again, I will let Dr. Adam Square lead off.
So before I answer that question specifically, I wanted to kind of tie this question back into question number two, and the point that John made about the Democratic position on this. And one of the reasons that they're using in terms of holding DHS hostage, and that's just for lack of better terminology, are trying to find bargaining chips. And one of the bargaining things that they had been advocating for was the removal of Kristi Noem. And so the president has removed her. And so the Republican response to that was, okay, good. Now the Democrats are going to come back together and vote and get DHS operational again. The response from the Democrats was that the underlying problems are more embedded than just the removal of the secretary. And then tying this in to this question number three, replacing her with Senator Markwayne Mullin of Oklahoma. Remember, I said to you that the president has the authority to nominate individuals, and that individual then has to be confirmed by the Senate. And so if and there have been some questions about this particular individual, Mullen, on both sides, the Democratic side and the Republican side. So there's not really at this point 100% rallying around Mullen. So that might be another delay in this. And then tying it right back to what John said with ICE in terms of wanting the mask removed, having their names identified. And that is top level of government when we look in terms of ICE. But even on the state and local level, one of the things that you share with people is that if you're having a confrontation, or I shouldn't use that word, a situation with police or state troopers or whatever, remain calm, get that individual's badge number, and then you can report to their superiors later. So I think it's that kind of that same framework that's going here. But to answer the question specifically about Christy, no, I said I was going to answer it specifically, but my answer is that there were multiple factors that led to the firing of Christy No. Uh, Probably the one that caught up with her the most was using taxpayer dollars to generate an ad for $270 million. And then the tipping point, which was even more egregious, is that she lied before Congress, stating that President Trump approved her spending the money for the ad. And lying before Congress is a federal offense punishable by law with maximum jail time of 5 years and $250,000 dollar fine. And then the last part of your question, the impact in terms of Nome being replaced, it's twofold. So Nome's replacement under consideration, Mark Wayne Mullen is pro-immigration, certainly a proponent of protecting the borders. And then secondly, Nome has been put into a position where she will work with other agencies and still promote her strong immigration stance and border security.
Thank you, Grace. That a great summary there of why we are losing our current Secretary of Homeland Security. The $200 million ad, that was interesting because I've seen it. And it is a majestic ad. If you've seen it, it's over $200 million. It has her prominently displayed on a horse. It looks like in Montana. It looks like it's an episode of Yellowstone. I mean, and there are many who ask, why did we spend that many tax dollars on an ad that really kind of looks like we're advertising you? Regarding her lies before Congress, that is definitely something that would be considered felonious. It's also important to note that she has lied about President Trump knowing about that money because President Trump says she lied. So there's possible debate there. She's also had some controversial administrative strategies as the head of the Department of Homeland Security. She's also in charge of FEMA, and she had a policy that I think it has to be unprecedented. Any requests from states for emergency funding over, I think, $100,000 had to go personally through her. When you look at national disasters that are declared by states and they require FEMA funding, $100,000 is literally drops in a bucket. So that has created this extraordinary backlog of FEMA requests that have been incredibly, I would say, costly in terms of political capital for the Trump administration. She's also had some issues, again, as Department of Homeland Security Secretary, back to ICE, back to Minnesota, back to 2 U.S. citizens who we have video from multiple perspectives being shot and killed in the streets within an hour after the second one. Forgive me, I have forgotten the name of the gentleman that was killed. I feel incredibly guilty having forgotten his name. But within, I think it was about an hour to an hour and a half after that, and after the video had gone out, she went to a press conference and referred to him as a domestic terrorist. This is the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, off the cuff, with absolutely no evidence whatsoever, referring to an American citizen who just got killed, some would say murdered, by the federal government, and calling him a domestic terrorist with absolutely no proof whatsoever. That was another extraordinarily bad look for the administration. So in many ways, she had started to put together a large number of embarrassing problems for the Trump administration. Now, when you look at the upcoming Secretary Mullen, if he is approved, again, as Grace has pointed out, President Trump, while he has the ability to fire department heads, because once you are appointed by the president to a as the secretary of a department, or if you're in the Justice Department, we call that the Attorney General. Once you are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, you then serve at the pleasure of the president. So the president can fire you without Senate approval, but former or future Secretary Mullen will have to be approved by the U.S. Senate. The timeline, I believe, is March 31st for Secretary Mullen to take over DHS if the Senate approves, which they should, because as we've mentioned again, the Senate has to approve these nominations, but the filibuster is something that we no longer use in the Senate for appointments after what we call the nuclear option was employed back in 2013 and I think 2017 for federal court judges and for appointments. The Senate won't use filibusters anymore. So I don't think the Democrats would have any possibility of getting future Secretary Mullen. I don't think they could stall his approval. In terms of what to expect from Secretary Mullen, he is as strong of a Trump ally as Secretary Noem, who is going out. Some would say he is more of a militant supporter of President Trump. So it's definitely a strong Trump supporter being replaced by a strong Trump supporter. I think he will free up the backlog at FEMA. I think he will. I would guarantee he will get rid of the policy of having to approve every single thing that's created that backlog. I think he's going to bring some more progressive management strategies to the DHS. I think he is going to fix some of the very easy to fix problems that we saw with Secretary Noem. But in terms of ICE, that's where the Democratic Party is going to be very disappointed, I think, with the new secretary. He is going to maintain a militant stance regarding undocumented immigrants, because that is one of the signature policies of the Trump administration from the 2024 election all the way till today. Images of ICE in states like Minnesota, while it was politically devastating, and the Republican President Trump did eventually, I think, order Secretary Noem to pull some of those not troops but officers out. You will see a militant approach to undocumented immigrants. That's not going to go anywhere, I don't think. But I can keep talking about this, but I'm going to choose now arbitrarily to stop because I feel like I've been talking enough.
I was just going to add one other thing, John, when you were identifying the situation in Minnesota, when Secretary Noem was testifying at the congressional hearing, she was asked, now that you made that mistake of identifying this individual as a domestic terrorist, do you want to retract your statement and admit that you had made a mistake by identifying him as such? And she refused to do that. So that was also another nail against her.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's hard to read into the crystal ball of why President Trump decided to make the change. It could just be about her trying to upstage him. It could be about spending all this money and saying that he approved it when he really didn't. It could be about the allegations that she's carrying on an affair with one of her senior advisors and using government resources for that. And it could be about lying before Congress and the president realizing that that's a red line for Congress in terms of getting things through. I think that and Starr has a question: why isn't she in jail? And the reality is that, unfortunately, when it comes to prosecuting these things, it's up to the executive branch, the Justice Department, to decide to do that. And as of yet, at least, Attorney General Pam Bondi has not decided to prosecute that. Now, she might in the future. I don't know. I suspect not. But I don't know what the statute of limitations on lying to Congress is. It could be a future administration might decide to prosecute her for it. I don't know. My suspicion is probably the statute of limitations will run out before there's a new administration. But I could be wrong on that point. Congress does set the statute of limitation for lying to Congress. And so they may decide that it's like, there's never a statute of limitations. I don't know. I would have to look that up. And somebody, and Star did point out in the chat that the gentleman's name was Alex Preddy. He was a ICU nurse for the Department of Veterans Affairs in in the Minneapolis area.
Thank you for
Sean
that.
points out in the chat also that certainly, as Dr. Hall and Dr. Adam Square both pointed out, at the end of the day, cabinet secretaries, presidential appointees do serve at the pleasure of the president, and if they don't think they're being effective at carrying out their agenda, they can dismiss them, right? And this has been settled in the United States for a century and a half, right? Back after the Civil War, there was a controversy over something called the Tenure of Office Act, where Congress did try to assert the ability to force the president to retain cabinet secretaries and government officials that had been confirmed, and that whole situation was resolved with the resolution, I guess, not to sound all circular, that Congress could not essentially restrain the president's ability to fire people in that position. In fact, recent Supreme Court decisions have actually reinforced the idea that the president has this authority over not just his own personal appointments, but other executive branch officials as well as independent regulatory agencies and things like that as well. So, unless Congress were to amend the Constitution, the states were to ratify some sort of thing to change the relationship between Congress and the executive branch to allow for when parliamentary systems would be called ministerial responsibility and things like that. The reality is that it's perfectly up to the president to decide who he wants to have in his cabinet, at least in terms of dismissals. Now, of course, Senator Mullen does need to get confirmed, and there is a tradition usually that senators will vote for other senators, and so he probably has a pretty good chance of getting through the process. Despite a lot of Democrats' misgivings, I think there's probably enough that are going to vote for him. And as Dr. Hall pointed out, right, the filibuster doesn't really apply here anyway. And even without Mullen's vote, they do have the votes they need to confirm him. So my suspicion is that probably will happen. Whether it happens in time for the 31st on the president's timeline is an open question that we will see resolved at some point in the future. Again, reminder, don't forget that we are accepting questions from the chat. So our next question, though, is about a different thing, which is something called the SAVE Act, sometimes referred to as the Save America Act. So what is the SAVE Act, and why is President Trump pushing for Congress to pass it? And Dr. Adam Square, I'll let you lead off on that one.
Well, one of the things that President Trump is looking for is that individuals ensure when they're voting, they have proof of citizenship. So the SAVE Act is Safeguard American Voter Eligibility. And so the act then is asking for citizens then to have that proof at the time of registration and have a photo ID at the time of voting. And so this act was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives in February 26, and we know for a bill to become law that it also has to be matched in the Senate as well for the president to sign it. So under the SAVE Act, every single state would be required to submit its voter registration list to the Department of Homeland Security for comparison to the agency's error-written database. And so that's really the SAVE Act in a nutshell. I was in a session yesterday afternoon, and the conversation lent itself that the SAVE Act may prevent certain voters from participating in the voting process, that they would need a passport. A lot of individuals don't have passport. If they have been previously married, they certainly have to have all of that documentation. If they have been remarried, that documentation as well. And then also in terms of immigration status in the sense that you have now become eligible to vote. And then there is another component to that, that there are penalties that for individuals who work at the polls, if perchance individual slips past them on their watch, there could be penalties against that poll worker.
Thank you, Grace. Great summary there. The SAVE Act. It's important, I think, to note, because great summary there. I want to look at it from another perspective. The SAVE Act exists. The Trump administration itself would tell you that it exists to stop one thing: in-person voter fraud. The problem, actually, the lack of a problem here is that there's the lack of that problem. Research after research after research has shown that the United States of America, and this is important. I feel like I should say this 5 or 6 times just in a row, nonstop, until I got incredibly annoying. The United States does not have any examples, absolutely none, of large-scale in-person voter fraud. So it's important to note that this legislation, in many ways, not in many ways, by definition, this is a solution searching for a problem that doesn't exist. That's something that is incredibly important to point out. We have longitudinal research that goes on constantly, exploring voter fraud accusations. Every single incidence of voter fraud is investigated by state and federal government entities until its conclusion. There is no example of voter fraud that has ever been accused that does not have an investigation all the way to completion. And 99% of the extraordinarily few examples are usually just mistakes that somebody made. So with that, the SAVE Act, that's really the major controversy. It's a solution searching for a problem that simply does not exist. The state of Utah, for example, just conducted research looking at several 100,000 votes, and they found one example of possible voter fraud. There's other research that looked over, longitudinal research that looked over multiple decades at literally over 1 billion examples of votes across the country and came up with about 35 different examples. If you're looking at billions of votes and 35 examples of possible voter fraud, that means there is no voter fraud. So that's the major controversy of the SAVE Act. We simply do not have large-scale in-person voter fraud, and that's just a fact. It's something we should be proud of. It's one of the single greatest examples of successful electoral politics right here in the United States. We have an extraordinarily efficient and clean electoral system, and we should be proud of that. The other problems, again, Grace, you've already pointed out, it's going beyond what many states require, and that's voter ID laws, where you show your driver's license and there you go, you vote. It's requiring you not to prove that you're a citizen of Georgia. It's requiring you to prove that you're an American citizen, which again, you're looking at birth certificates, you're looking at passports, and that's something that the average person just does not have readily available. It doesn't mean it's impossible to get. It just makes it harder to vote. Also, if you're a woman or a man, but traditionally when you get married, women take the male. I'm not saying this is good or bad, but historically that's what we do. If you are trying to register, if this act were to pass and you're married, you are going to have exponentially more difficulty than a man would have because your last name no longer matches your birth certificate or your passport. You are now going to have to provide your wedding marriage license. What this is doing is making it extremely difficult for Americans to register to vote in order to prevent a problem that does not exist. And that's really the controversy that many have against it. There's another element to the SAVE Act that we need to point out. It's not going to pass. The Democrats will not allow this to pass through the Senate. They have said this is going to be a stand that will be made. And I think it's already dead. I think it's interesting for us to talk about it because I don't think it's going away. I think this is something that could come back again and again. But I think it's about impossible for this to pass. And again, I want to point out that all those opinions that I might have felt like I was bringing out, those were the opinions of the opposition forces to the SAVE Act, which there are many people who look at the SAVE Act and think, what's the point, other than to possibly disenfranchise voters. It's also important to note, if you're registered to vote in the state of Georgia, this won't affect you. This is something that would affect someone going to register to vote. But there are states like Georgia that have a tendency and have statutory laws on the books that will purge registration voters pools if you have not voted recently. So in many states that have voter ID laws, if you haven't voted in the last couple of elections, you need to double check because you might have very easily been purged, and then it would affect you if it were to pass. But again, this is not going to pass. I'm not guaranteeing that, but I'm 99% sure the SAVE Act is dead.
And I was glad to hear John mention that these studies and surveys are out there that are showing that voter fraud is extremely minimal. There was a search warrant served to Fulton County voter department a few months ago, and files were taken by the federal government, and the individuals representing the Fulton County basically said that Brad Rothenberger, all of those individuals, they've looked at these files over and over again. They're not going to find any discrepancies. So, John, I was glad to hear you say that.
Yeah, and again, it does happen, but again, 9 times out of 10, the very few times it happens, it's a mistake. And it's also important to note that the Trump administration itself, if anyone is familiar with the 2020 election, President Trump and then civilian President Trump after January 20th, 2021, made many accusations about voter fraud, taking many of those cases to federal court. Every single one of those cases was thrown out, not found to not be the case, thrown out for total lack of evidence. And you can actually see the language used when attorneys for the administration in 2020 were publicly saying there's voter fraud, there's voter fraud, there's voter fraud. But when you see them in court, they would literally then say, we are not accusing anyone of voter fraud. It's one thing to exercise your First Amendment right in public to say there's voter fraud, but when you're in a court of law and you have a Juris Doctorate and you have passed the bar, if you perjure yourself in a court of law, you're going to lose your license. So even the Trump administration's accusations, literally all of them after the 2020 election, were thrown out. So again, this is not a critique necessarily of the Trump administration. This is me hoping that everyone listening will be very proud of the fact that we have an extraordinarily clean electoral process in terms of a lack of in-person voter fraud on a large scale. Something to be proud of.
Okay, thank you. Just one other thing I would comment on. I guess one thing to note is, as Dr. Hall suggested, the lack of passage of the SAVE Act does, of course, depend on the continuation of the filibuster applying to bills. It doesn't seem like in the moment there's an appetite to go nuclear again in terms of the filibuster, in terms of allowing ordinary legislation to avoid the filibuster. There has been some discussion of trying to use what's called the reconciliation process, which doesn't allow for the filibuster to get the SAVE Act or some elements of the SAVE Act through. There's a lot of questions about whether or not that could be used for that if we get in the parliamentary weeds that we don't really want to get into. But as a practical matter, I think there are enough Republicans that realize that the demographics of the people that tend to have passports and tend to have lots of ways to validate their citizenship actually tend to favor Democrats at this point. In terms of the people that are more likely to travel abroad, the people that have documentation of their citizenship, most of them, or a disproportionate share of them, are going to be naturalized citizens rather than natural born citizens. And the only other point I would add is there has been some discussion of requiring some sort of mass re-registration as part of this. Before the November elections, if there was any possibility of trying to do that, it would be completely impractical to re-register 200 plus million voters in the next 6 to 7 months. There's just simply not the resources to do that as a practical matter without real serious problems. And so as both Dr. Hall and Dr. Adams Square pointed out, right, this is essentially a solution in search of a problem. I think it's become sort of an article of faith among certain people that there is this, that in spite of all evidence to the contrary, that there's this massive, non-citizen voting, or that there's a bunch of people that are impersonating a bunch of other people. And the reality is that it just doesn't happen, not at the scale that would be necessary to affect elections. Does it happen occasionally? Yes. Do people occasionally vote for their dead grand on behalf of their dead grandma or that sort of thing? Yes. And what happens? Why do we know that? Because they get caught, they get arrested, they go to jail. And there have been cases of this where people have voted for their husbands or wives or their sick relatives, or the junior votes for senior, uh, and they've been caught, because the way they easily get caught is you have to make sure that you don't vote on behalf of somebody that is also going to vote. And they check against the death records. And they have tightened up the voter registration rolls. There are not millions of dead people on the rolls anymore, right? And that's something that, both the current and past Secretary of States of Georgia, Governor Kemp and Brad Raffensperger have made a very prominent part of their discussions over the last decade. Is we have done a lot of things to make sure that the records are tight and are legit. And so the whole idea that there is this widespread, massive voter fraud going on is, to be perfectly frank, ridiculous. It's not borne out by the evidence. Now, again, you could argue about, absentee ballots and mail-in ballots and things like that. But the reality is, and yes, there is the possibility of people being coerced in those cases. But the one thing about mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, is they don't just take any ballot, right? If you've ever voted an absentee ballot, you know how this works, right? You are not just sent a ballot in the mail and just said send this back willy-nilly, right? There's a whole process. There's a chain of custody involved that makes sure that ballots that were not sent out in the first place don't get counted, right? They have to come back with, in a numbered envelope. It has to be traced back to the voter. They have to sign it. You have to provide information that verifies you're the voter. Again, it's just not passable at the scale that would affect elections. Again, could it affect a local election for mayor when 10 people show up? Yes. Is it going to affect a presidential election? Not even at the scale of Florida in 2000, where it was 400 and some votes, right? That, much less thousands, tens of thousands. It just doesn't. It doesn't scale. It just doesn't work. Anybody that's worked on elections and is a serious broker can tell you that, whether a Republican, a Democrat, Libertarian, whatever. Is there a place or resource to learn more about midterms and candidates and new laws bills? Lots of places. Obviously, I would encourage you to check out various news outlets. You actually have access to a free subscription in the New York Times as a Middle Georgia State University student, so you may want to check into that through the library. Also, there's resources like Ballotpedia, I believe it's what it's called, Ballotpedia. I can't remember what it's called exactly. That has information on every single election coming up and details about the candidates, details about those sort of things. For things going on in Georgia, I always recommend things like GPB, Georgia Public Broadcasting, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, although that costs money, but can be worth it if you're really into politics. WABE in Atlanta also has a lot of stuff. They're not part of GPB, but they have their own stuff. Georgia Recorder, I think, is another one that does some state level stuff. And I think we're ready to move on to our last question. The Supreme Court is expected to rule in the coming months on a number of important cases. If you were to pick out two or three of the most important ones, what are they, and how do you think they're likely to rule on those cases? And I'll let again Dr. Adams Square lead off.
I looked at this question, but I took a different approach. I primarily was focusing on the relationship between the president and the Supreme Court as it related to the emergency docket. And when we're talking about emergency docket, we're talking about the court just making a temporary decision, not a final decision. So I just wanted to look in terms of how the court was responding to the president in these emergency situations. So I looked at the Trump versus Wilcox case, and basically it really reinforced what we had been talking about earlier, that the president does have the authority to fire individuals. And in that particular case, the president has the power to fire members of independent agencies. I know we just talked earlier about the 15 departments. We didn't have the discussion about the independents. I also looked at Trump versus Slaughter. And once again, the president was allowed to remove a member of the Federal Trade Commission. And just maybe one or two more things. When I looked in terms of the overall number of emergency docket petitions, basically the president going before the court, not in agreement with a lower court decision. The Supreme Court has ruled, well, there have been 25 emergency petitions or dockets before the Supreme Court by the President Trump administration. And the Supreme Court ruled favorably in 20 of those situations, and they ruled only 5 times against. Just a couple other things. The McMahon versus New York. This is the Secretary of the Department of Education, McMahon. The court allowed the Department of Education to terminate employees while the litigation proceeds. So that is an upcoming case, but those individuals are no longer in that position. So they're waiting to see what the outcome of that is. And when we're talking about the Department of Education, this is part of President Trump's effort to dismantle the Department of Education. And I want to say this when we're talking about the Department of Education, we're not just going to point the finger at President Trump and say that he wants to do that. This has really been an ongoing tradition since the inception of the Department of Education. The Department of Education came into existence under President Jimmy Carter, part of the Democratic Party. Typically, most Republican presidents since then, starting with President Reagan, began the ball to dismantle the Department of Education. However, that was sidelined. But the one Republican president that really put a hold on dismantling Department of Education was President George W. Bush, because he wanted to get his education legislation, No Child Left Behind, behind. So as it relates to this particular court case, McMahon versus New York, the court has allowed the Department of Education to terminate the employees while the litigation goes on. So it will be a case to watch. And the one final thing that I wanted to say, that President Trump did lose a case in December, and the court refused to block an order by President Trump in terms of the deployment of the National Guard in Illinois. So that was basically limiting the executive power. But when you look in terms of the Supreme Court, this is a chapter that we're getting ready to go into. President Trump has been instrumental in putting 3 appointees on the Supreme Court. And so that kind of lends itself in terms of the favorability that President Trump has in terms of getting these emergency dockets through the court. And that's it.
Thank you, Grace. A great summary there, and you hit some huge cases, especially regarding the Federal Reserve's independence, other agency independence in terms of hiring and firing capabilities of the president. I'm going to hit on a couple of what I think are big opinions coming up. I'm going to start with one that I rarely ever do this. I'm going to guarantee the outcome. Well, not guarantee. I'm going to 99% the outcome. This is a case, I don't know if anyone's following it. It's Trump v. Barbara. This is a case regarding 14th Amendment birthright citizenship. Now, if you're in our 1101s, depending on if we've gotten there yet, and if you're in my class, we have, birthright citizenship was granted with the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is the birthright citizenship. It starts the 14th Amendment. If you're born or naturalized here, you are a citizen of the United States. That is about as simple as it can possibly get. What could possibly give the president the executive power to alter that? It has a lot to do with the specific nomenclature that's used. It says in the 14th that if you're born here or if you are naturalized here, you're a citizen, meaning everyone's an equal citizen. We don't have rankings of citizenship. We don't have castes of citizens. We have citizens and non-citizens. So how can this possibly be revoked unilaterally by the president? There is language that says, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. You might wonder, what does that mean? Because this is what the Trump administration is jumping on. And subject to the jurisdiction thereof has historically been interpreted to mean if you are the ambassador from France, you are living in New York City, or maybe you work at the United Nations, you are a representative from France, I'm just picking France. If you are pregnant and have a baby in New York City, your baby is not subject to the jurisdiction thereof because you are an ambassador and you have immunity as a diplomat. You have diplomatic immunity. You could commit 5,000 felonies as an ambassador to France in New York City. In New York City, neither New York City nor the federal government nor the state of New York can prosecute you. Don't worry about rogue agents from France in this case because they would immediately be sent back to France and be punished there. But the point is that and subject to the jurisdiction thereof is a reference to a microscopic group of people who are literally not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States of America. That is what the Trump administration is trying to twist into meaning illegal or undocumented immigrants who have babies here. The Trump administration is trying to say that the 14th Amendment only referred to recently freed African slaves who were no longer slaves after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, but were living in a horrifying political limbo, not slaves, but not necessarily citizens. And I will be the first to say that the catalyst for the 14th Amendment's birthright citizenship was most definitely recently freed slaves and a successful attempt to make them officially U.S. citizens. But it has literally never been questioned before that birthright citizenship means if you are born here, when it says that, it means if you are born here. So that's where I'm getting with my possible guarantee. The birthright citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment has always been interpreted to mean if you're born here or naturalized here, you are a citizen here. It does not mean if your mother is illegally here and you're born here, you're not a citizen, because even if your mother is here illegally, she is still subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and the state in which you're in. So that's why, even with, and as Dr. Adam Square points out, this is President Trump's court. He has not only nominated successfully 1/3 of the U.S. Supreme Court, he has nominated over 1/3 of the lower courts. When you look at the appellate court, the Circuit Court of Appeals, when you look at the 11 numbered geographic circuit courts of appeals, when you look at all of the 94 plus district courts, he has appointed over 1/3 of the entire judiciary. But even with the super majority on the federal Supreme Court, I cannot possibly imagine them finding the 14th Amendment to the Constitution being unconstitutional. And I say that only halfway joking. So that's one guarantee. Not a guarantee, but I'm pretty sure birthright citizenship will remain. Some other cases, there's some cases involving civil liberties cases for the LGBT community that are coming up. I'm not entirely sure if anyone or everyone is familiar with conversion therapy. This is a shockingly controversial area of, I don't want to call it science because I don't think it's backed by science. But there are those who believe that if you have a homosexual person, let's say a teenager or a 20-something, that you can convert them from being gay into being straight. Unless I'm very, very wrong, there is no science backing this up at all, and it has been shown to be psychologically very damaging to take someone who is openly gay and try to turn them into a heterosexual. Many states have banned this practice, Colorado in particular, and it's in Colorado that this case is going before the court. Conversion therapy is illegal in Colorado, and it is now being questioned before the federal Supreme Court as to whether or not that is constitutionally permissible. Now, the argument, while conversion therapy can very easily be questioned for any merits whatsoever scientifically, there is a constitutional argument here that is valid. If I am in Colorado and I want to take part in trying to convert a gay person into a straight person or a homosexual person into a heterosexual person, is that my right under the First Amendment speech clause? If it is, then Colorado's ban on conversion therapy is unconstitutional, and that's what the court will say. However, it could be a legitimate regulatory power of the state of Colorado to protect members of the LGBT community from this psychologically damaging conversion therapy. So that's the question before the court. Is it a First Amendment speech case, or is it simply legitimate regulation by state government? If the court says it's legitimate regulation by state government, the conversion therapy ban will probably be upheld. If, on the other hand, they say that it's a First Amendment speech case, it's probably going to be overturned. Another LGBT community civil liberties case that connects with that involves transgender athletes at the high school level. Several states have banned transgender athletes from participating in sports that are not the sex that they were born at birth. I think I said that right.
Yeah.
This is a controversial issue because this actually crosses over party lines. There's bipartisan support, depending on the polls that you look at, and this is still a very fresh issue. We're still trying as a nation state, our political culture is still trying to come to an understanding of this and many other transgender rights. But this is something where you'll find Republicans and Democrats on the same side in some cases. But can states ban transgender athletes? That's another case. If I were predicting, I think the transgender ban, and this is, again, I don't mean to be flippant here as if I'm predicting something that affects the lives of so many people. I think there's a very strong possibility that this court is going to uphold the transgender bans. I am not as confident on the conversion therapy, but again, it just depends on how they look at it. These are two cases involving current civil liberties issues. There are many more. I know we're running low on time. I want to make sure that everybody else has a chance. So I'll slow down there and open the floor back up. But those are, Grace, you brought us some great cases in terms of presidential power. These are some civil liberties cases. There's also some voting rights cases coming up, one particular in Louisiana that's questioning what remains of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Most of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was gutted by Shelby County v. Holder when the court said that the states that had to go through a pre-clearance with the federal government regarding their voter registration laws, they had successfully proved themselves to no longer be racist, and that was basically taken out. But there's still a component of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that says you can, I don't want to use the word gerrymander, but you can draw congressional districts in a way that provides a boost to the possibility of recognizing in terms of minority majority districts so that you can have more districts that have a majority African-American population, particularly because of the extraordinarily long history of many states disenfranchising those voters through partisan gerrymandering. That's an incredibly important case coming out of Louisiana that will literally dictate whether or not districts like in Alabama, the Alabama 2nd Congressional District now exists as a Democratic district because the court used that element of the Voting Rights Act of 65 to force the state of Alabama to redraw districts that they had found to be illegally racially gerrymandered. Many other opinions coming up. Stay in touch with class, and we will cover a lot of those, but I'll leave the floor back open because I know we're running out of time.
Thank you, Dr. Hall and Dr. Adam Square. Yeah, we do have a couple of follow-ups from the chat here. So for Sean's question, so for illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants or unauthorized immigrants, right? Does that create a, I guess, pathway to citizenship for the parents or mother, I guess, of an undocumented immigrant, or they are not a documented immigrant, their child is a citizen. Does the child create this pathway? The short answer is pretty much no. It's a pretty convoluted process to gain naturalization through relatives. And my recollection is that the process for somebody that was undocumented at the time that they had a child is Byzantine to the extent that it's almost impossible to navigate. What usually happens is that they're able to leverage it into some sort of deferred action status or something like that, where they remain a non-citizen and might have a pathway towards normalizing their status, which is the legal term for basically going from a unauthorized or illegal or undocumented immigrant to a documented or legal or that sort of thing immigrant. But there are a lot of steps to go beyond that to get citizenship. And I believe I would have to look this up, but I believe the law basically makes that almost impossible unless you have some really high-powered lawyers, which most people in this situation don't. Essentially, I mean, there are always loopholes and that sort of thing, but the reality is that the anchor baby sort of idea, could it allow for people to stay in the U.S. under some circumstances under a favorable administration? Yes. Does that translate into them getting citizenship? Almost always no. But again, there are always exceptions. Um, in terms of conversion therapy and the other questions, I think those are just questions you're going to have to answer on your own, or consider with your friends and colleagues and that sort of thing. We certainly don't have time to address the complexity of that issue in the next 30 seconds, so I will defer that to your lives, unless Dr. Hall has something he wants to add on that.
Really quickly, great question on the conversion therapy. If the court says that if the court says that banning conversion therapy is a violation of the First Amendment speech right, that doesn't mean all states have to have it. It doesn't mean all states can't have it. It simply means that no state can ban it. So that would be a 100% state issue. In terms of the trans athletes question, that's a great question. We have out of time.
And
Be continued.
I just quickly wanted to go back to a question earlier that Sean asked as it related to Christy No, wanting to know if she was removed based on the quality of the job that she did. From the administration standpoint, they felt that she did a very good job in terms of immigration. We had the discussion about ICE. Presidents usually pick people based on loyalty. So she did exemplify loyalty. And for that reason, he did not remove her from the federal government. He still has her employed there, just in a different capacity. So from individuals looking at it from that standpoint, she was a good uh, individual, and she did do the job that President Trump asked her to do.
That's a good point. Yeah, and of course, always bear in mind that although this president wouldn't necessarily be the president to do it, but in general, right, there is a sort of expectation that normally people that have are dismissed from jobs like this do get a glowing sort of pat on the back on the way out. So what is being publicly said and what the president actually privately thinks are perhaps two different questions. But certainly, I don't think there was dissatisfaction with the substance of what she was doing. I think it was more about either the optics, or as they put it, or as both of you pointed out, right? I think the marketing video. I think in particular the idea that you're going to spend essentially the budget for a blockbuster movie to make an ad for yourself is frankly insane. I just it just boggles the mind that in my mind that anybody would spend $200 million on this. Again, you could make a Hollywood movie for, well, I mean, there have been independent films that have been made for a hundredth of that, and were successful, right? Things like the Blair Witch Project and stuff did not cost $200 million. Now, granted, they probably didn't have the production values of Yellowstone either, but you could make some pretty good television or movies for that sort of money. So anyway, we have run out of time officially, so I want to first thank all of our panelists, Dr. Hall and Dr. Adam Square, for their insights. I want to thank our audience for your great questions and for coming out. And I just wanted to remind everybody that we do have one more event coming up in about 3 weeks on April 1st. Not April, it is April Fool's Day, but it's not April Fool's. We'll actually be having a conversation. Dr. Caverly and Dr. Hall and I will be talking about state and local politics as we approach the end of the legislative session, which is expected to happen on April 2nd. So we will talk about things happening in state and local politics, and also perhaps upcoming elections and things like that. And also the recording for this will be available on our YouTube page probably later on today, so keep an eye out for that. Again, thank you all for coming out, and I appreciate it. And thank you again, Dr. Adam Square and Dr. Hall, and hope everybody has a good evening and a good remainder of your week.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
See you, Matt.